provides the reason, or a good reason, in that it's the single most preventable cause of premature death in the United States and globally. And I just want to remind all of you, and I think most of you know it, but it kills 480,000 Americans every year. Just think about that. It is a staggering number, and then approximately 8 million globally. So we have to keep an eye on cigarette smoking, but also the other tobacco products that are flooding the U.S. tobacco marketplace every day. You know, examples, e-cigarettes, nicotine pouches, and we have to keep our eye on those for their own toxicity. None of these products are safe, but some are safer than combusted cigarettes. And so we have to keep our eye on them for as potential toxins and harmful products, but also potential substitutes for those who cannot or will not quit nicotine use completely, harm reduction. And then another reason we focus on this is my second item up there, insufficient healthcare response. So, you know, I just reflect on, and I don't want to go into details about any particular hospital, or especially about our own, but if you interact with the healthcare system or the public health system in your state, you often get a sense when you think about it in terms of those statistics I just shared with you, a kind of indifference or insensitivity. So what I've found myself thinking about is the response to COVID. It was huge. I mean, in our hospital, everything was rescheduled, reorganized. And then I went back and looked, well, how many people died in the United States related to COVID in 2020, the year when all these transformations were happening, and we could not, Eli Klemper and I were trying to get some small things done related to smoking. 350,000 people died of COVID that year. So 100,000 less than would die from smoking, but we couldn't get any movement on smoking. So it's just I don't have an explanation for why that's so, but it is my experience that it's that way. So that's another reason. Then the disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations. And we'll hear a lot about that the next 2 days, today and tomorrow. But these are the populations that my colleagues and I have devoted the last couple, the last decade at least, really the last couple of decades. So which populations? Well, people who are experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage, racial, ethnic minorities, sexual minority populations. Now it's those who reside in rural residents, and you'll hear more about that on tomorrow. And these are populations who are already suffering a wide range of pressures and adversity, and tobacco use is one more. And then I'd like to plant a little seed or reminder that when we're talking about these populations, say the population with opioid use disorder or comorbid addiction, they often have these other risk factors as well present. So they not only have opioid use disorder, but they're economically disadvantaged. They might be a sexual minority. They might be a rural resident. So all those are factors that they're wrestling with as we try and encourage them to quit smoking or to go to a less toxic form of nicotine use. And then the last one is advocacy. So by having a conference focused on it, we keep it front and center, or at least we try and do that. And so these vulnerable populations, they don't have people raising heck with legislators and policymakers about why more isn't being done. So I think to some extent that falls on us. So I'd like to keep it front and center scientifically, and then also, where the opportunity presents, do something, push your local policymakers or healthcare leaders to do more. All right, so I now want to also mention some news that maybe many of you already know, But we lost a giant in addiction science this past Saturday, Warren Bickel, who you see here on the slide. And Warren was also the chair of the Vermont Center on Behavior and Health Advisory Board. So he was on the Vermont faculty for 17 years. So big loss. It came too close to the conference for us to rework programming in to honor him, but we will going forward. So, and as you go through the day, he made so many contributions. Think about it whether you see Warren's work in the thing that you're presenting or, you know, as you're listening to a presentation. All right, so now on to more uplifting news. We have a video welcome from U.S. Senator Peter Welch that I want to share with you. And he couldn't be here in person, but he sends his best wishes.
We Vermonters are very proud that the University of Vermont and the Larner College of Medicine are home to the Center on Behavior and Health. The center's work in support of researchers who are trying to understand and address the disparities in health is so very critical, right here at home in Vermont and around the country and really around the world. As we know from living in Vermont, rural areas are particularly vulnerable to health disparities. And I applaud the center's work in translating research into practice and in facilitating this very important conference. If we stand any chance of reducing harm, improving treatment, and supporting recovery, we need to better understand the risk of substance misuse. This includes understanding the intersections between tobacco use and other drugs and their impact on chronic disease and health disparities. The conference also focuses on women's health and health disparities. As I said last year, amidst continued efforts to undermine and control women's health care, it's necessary to pay pointed attention to the health and well-being of women, and I thank you for taking this approach with your work. All of today's conference participants will be inspired by their peers and the opportunity to share and discuss new research and findings. Your work is powerful and necessary for achieving understanding and strategies to improve population health and well-being, to provide more opportunities for the best possible quality of life. Thank you for this work and enjoy the conference.
Great, and thanks to Peter Welch and his staff for taking the time from their busy schedule to welcome us that warmly. All right, so now to the fun part of the morning for me. We're going to hear from our keynote speaker, Nancy Rigotti. And I just want to make a plug. This morning, when I clicked on to the New York Times, there was an article on Nancy's topic. So how timely. We've never had good timing like that. And in the article, citing Nancy's work on this topic along the lines that we've been talking about, trying to bring new treatments for smoking cessation. So this is the best ever in 12 years. But it's really a pleasure to introduce Nancy. She's a general internal medicine physician and a professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. She is also director of their tobacco treatment service and founder and director of the Tobacco Research and Treatment Center at MGH, Massachusetts General Hospital. Nancy did her undergraduate training in human biology at Stanford and then medical school residency, clinical and research fellowships at Harvard Medical School. It's just a beautiful, I love reading CVs, and Nancy's was really a treat. She's truly a world leader in smoking and other tobacco use research. She's been continuously supported by the NIH since the mid-1980s. She's served as a reviewer and editor on several U.S. Surgeon General reports on smoking, an invited member of the Institute of Medicine National Academy of Science committees on tobacco product regulation and e-cigarette safety, and is currently a member of the FDA's Tobacco Product Safety Advisory Board. So those are really high status, high impact activities and services. She's served as the president of the Society for Nicotine and Tobacco, so that society that all of us many of us are well familiar with, but also the Society of General Internal Medicine, sort of Nancy's two specialty areas, general medicine, internal medicine, but a focus on tobacco throughout. She's won numerous national awards for research excellence and has also been an active research mentor throughout her career with a deep commitment to advancing the careers of women scientists. So that includes our own Joanna Streck. We still claim ownership, but she did her doctoral training with us and then went on to great postdoctoral training with Nancy and her colleagues. And then we also took the liberty of pairing a couple of our physicians who are a part of the VCBH with Nancy at dinner tonight by their request when they saw Nancy was going to be here, with an opportunity to learn from a physician who is also an expert in tobacco control and regulatory science. Nancy's a prolific author with more than 400 peer-reviewed articles in all the major medical and public health journals you could think of. And I just want to say, and I complimented her on it, you know you're off to a good start when your first publication is the first author paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that's the case. I just had a big smile on my face when I saw it, and it's followed by many more. So it wasn't a one-off. But that's like remarkable. So and it's fun to see. So today Nancy's going to speak to us about her research on cytisine as a new smoking cessation medication, new to the United States, hopefully, but has been used for a number of years in Central and Eastern Europe. And so Nancy is just doing important groundbreaking work, and we're going to hear about it today. So let's give a warm welcome to Nancy Rigotti.
Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful introduction. I feel like there's the only way to go is down from here. But I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very happy to be talking about one of my favorite topics these days. Okay, can I do it? I'm going to do it this way. Oh, okay. That's fine. Okay, so I'm going to talk about cytisine for tobacco cessation, new opportunities for an old drug. And let me go. Here are my disclosures. And the most important one for you to know about is Achieve Life Sciences, which is a small pharmaceutical company in Seattle, Washington, that is its mission, its business is to get cytisine FDA approved in the United States and then ultimately sell it probably at other countries. I've been a consultant for them along with some other academics, folks around the country. And I've had 2 research grants from them as well, but I have no equity in the company, so that when they cash out and get rich, I will be happy for them. So anyway, but it's important that you understand that connection. Okay, so as we know, current tobacco cessation medications, we have them, but there are really only 3. And nicotine replacement, bupropion, and varenicline. And the effectiveness and availability of what we have is limited. First of all, they help, we know they're evidence-based, they're better than placebo, but they don't help every smoker. Medications also have a lot of side effects, costs, and availability problems. For example, you can no longer get the nicotine inhaler. For a while, you couldn't get varenicline. And so there have been a lot of issues. Varenicline has a bad name because of concerns early on that it caused psychiatric side effects, which were later found to be not true, and the black box taken off. And really, the real problem is that we haven't had a new medicine for smoking cessation since 2006, which is almost 20 years. And contrast that with the situation for diabetes medicines or cancer medicines. I mean, we just feel like every week, not every week, every month, every quarter, there's a new diabetes medicine or an obesity medicine. And we just haven't had anything for smoking for a long time. So clearly we need some new options. And so what I'd like to do today is propose to you that cytisine could be that option. It's a plant-based alkaloid that is grows on what's called the golden rain plant, which is native to Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. And here's a picture of what it looks like, very pretty. The reason we're talking about it is that it has a mechanism similar to varenicline, which is our single best individual agent for smoking cessation. It acts as a partial agonist at the alpha-4 beta-2 nicotine receptors in the brain that mediate nicotine dependence, so that it can give you some relief of nicotine withdrawal when you stop smoking, but because it binds so tightly and irreversibly to the nicotine receptors, if you smoke while you're taking it, you don't get the normal reward that you would have from smoking. And so that makes it less attractive. It's been used as a low-cost generic smoking cessation aid in Eastern and Central Europe for decades. It's made by two companies, one in Bulgaria, one in Poland, which have the trees and produce the product. But it had really been not known outside of that part of the world for a long time. And the reason seemed to be that whatever science was written about it was really written in Russian or Polish, and these were countries that were behind the Iron Curtain. And so like people who speak English didn't bother to pay attention to it until a Swiss physician discovered this and translated it and started to get a group of us interested in the fact that this might be another smoking cessation medication. So the modern clinical trial evidence of efficacy and safety really only began around 2011, and I'll show you that briefly in a moment. It's not widely available in Western Europe countries or elsewhere, not available in the United States. In Canada, it was approved not as a medical product that went through the normal pathways, but as a natural product that a very enterprising pharmacist came up with. He went through the natural product pathway, and it's been available since 2017. But my colleagues in Canada tell me that it's not used very much there, partly because it's a natural product and it doesn't have anybody advertising it. And it also is not covered, that costs about $100 for the traditional dosage, and it is not covered by insurance because it's a natural product. So one of these sad stories. In the UK, approved it as a medication just January, so they're only starting to use it there. And that was done not because somebody went in and went to the British equivalent of the FDA and did studies. It was because the regulatory agencies accepted the evidence that already existed and just accepted it and said, okay, we'll add it on. So these are the two trials that kind of put it on the map. Both of them published in the New England Journal in the last decade or so. The first was a placebo-controlled trial that compared cytisine to placebo in Poland. There was a measurable and statistically significant quit rate, you can see, but the quit rates were low because the behavioral piece was very limited. The second one was a comparison of cytisine versus nicotine patch for smoking cessation that was done in New Zealand, largely on a Maori population. And they found, again, that it was clearly clinically effective and had higher quit rates as well. And when that was about to be published, I had the opportunity to write an editorial about cytisine, and sort of that got me really interested in seeing that there was something here. And so I called this article, Cytisine, a Tobacco Treatment Hiding in Plain Sight. And because I was fascinated that could this be an effective new medicine for smoking cessation? And we needed one even then. And in particular, varenicline had a really bad name at that point. And I thought, is it going to be like varenicline, but a drug that smokers will be eager to take? Could it be an affordable, even more important, could it be an affordable and accessible drug to help the world's smokers, 80% of whom now are living in low and middle income countries. And in those countries, the government simply don't usually make medications for smoking cessation accessible. The challenge for the USA, and then it was like, well, how can we make this available here? The challenge is it's a generic drug. It's been out there. So it's hard to make a business case, because if you spend say, $60 to $80 million, it's estimated to be required to get a drug approved in the United States by the FDA. you know, it's generic, you don't have any patent and anybody else can come in and make the same thing and not spend that money. So there's not a business case for it. And then if you could figure out how to brand it, that would be great, but then it would end up being probably very expensive. So how do you make this work? I didn't have an answer for this at all. I just put it out there as important questions. And I subsequently was contacted by this company, Achieve Life Sciences, which was started by two British pharmacists who had done this kind of work with unknown medications. And they decided to try to develop this medicine and make it available in the United States and the rest of the world. And what they're doing is they're using the cytisine from Bulgaria. So they're using an existing product. So they have a deal whereby they have the rights to sell cytisine everywhere in the world except a couple of countries in Eastern Europe. And because the manufacturer really isn't interested in expanding. They renamed it cytisinicline, which there's something called the USAN name, which is just another name for a generic product. I don't know why I'd probably to differentiate it, they gave it a new name, but that is the generic name, not the brand name. And they started a full drug development program that they funded initially with their own money and then went out to the markets and got financial support from the markets. The preclinical studies that were done partly, there was some funding from the NIH, from the Center for Complementary and Integrative Medicine, because they were interested in a drug that might be, they've done great studies and they've shown that a lot of things that we think might have worked didn't work so well. And they were looking for a winner and they thought this looked like a winner. And so a very wise, a leader in that institute figured out a way to channel some money to the company to do the preclinical work. And then they got an IND, an Investigational New Drug Application award in 2017. At that point, they could do clinical trials. That was the beginning of clinical trials. And at that point, they reached out to a number of academics around the country who have been advising them. And I'm one of many, not the only one, since then. So let me tell you about the clinical side of things. So the first thing that they did, which was really smart, was they said, how do we know that we have the right dose? So the traditional dose that's been used in Eastern Europe is a 25-day downward titration. You start with 6 times a day and you go down to 1 time a day, and it's a 1.5 milligram tablet. Nobody knows where that came from. So the thought was, well, why don't we see whether maybe there's a better dose? So that's what they did. And they did pharmacokinetic studies to show that you could use it as little as 3 times a day. It had to be 3 times a day to keep adequate blood levels. But they also did a trial to see how high the dose could be before you started having bad side effects or any negative effects. And it turned out that you could actually go quite high. It got to like 30 milligrams and you were still okay. So they decided to try increasing the dose and giving it for 3 times a day and comparing that to the traditional dose, and did a pilot study that found that it was effective. So the next thing they did was they went to the FDA and they said, you know, here's what we've got, but we think we'd like to use it for longer because after all, we don't use other smoking cessation medicines for only 1 month because we think of this as a disease that's chronic. And while maybe we should be giving medicine for life, but we don't, but we at least probably need more than 1 month. And so they proposed a 6-week and a 12-week regimen. And the FDA said you have to do 2, that said they would not accept the evidence done in other countries, even though it was published in a fancy journal, and that they had to do these 2 trials in the United States that were large and compared to placebo. So that's what they've done. And I helped them with the first one, and we've published that one, which is listed here, and I'll show you that details in a moment. The second one is also completed, done at a different set of US sites, and has been presented at SRNT, but hasn't been published yet. So Here's the first one, which is called the ORCA-2 trial. And the goal of this trial was to test the efficacy and safety of a longer course of a new cytisinicline regimen with behavioral support in both groups versus placebo. So the point was to compare 6 weeks versus placebo and 12 weeks versus placebo, but not directly to compare them with each other because we didn't think we had the statistical power to do so. Although it was scientifically an interesting question, it wasn't required by the FDA to get it approved. So here's the study design, which you see the picture of on the right-hand side. It was a double-blind randomized trial. It had 3 arms. So you either took placebo. I'm sorry, you either took the active ingredient for 12 weeks, the active ingredient for 6 weeks, and then placebo, or you took placebo for 12 weeks. Everybody took 1 pill 3 times a day for 12 weeks. Everybody got a lot of behavioral support. It was people came in every week during the period of treatment. It's a classic efficacy trial design. Everybody was followed for 24 weeks, so out to 6 months, 3 months after the end of the treatment. And because of the design, 2/3 of the people got active drug. What the inclusion criteria had to be an adult. You had to smoke at least 10 cigarettes a day and have a high enough expired air CO to prove it. You couldn't have used other tobacco products in the last 2 weeks. We tried to keep it simple. You had to be willing to set a quit date within a week after you start the medication. You had to be medically and psychiatrically stable. Well, what did that mean? That meant that you couldn't have been hospitalized for an acute cardiovascular event in the last 3 months. You couldn't have had much psychiatric disorder. You couldn't have had schizophrenia, bipolar, psychosis diagnoses. You couldn't have had actually, you couldn't have had any suicidal ideation recently. And you couldn't have had moderate or severe depression. And we also did screen so that you couldn't have other substance uses in your urine, although we did not test for cannabis. So the outcomes, the primary outcome was biochemically verified continuous abstinence in the last 4 weeks of treatment, verified by CO. In the 6-week arm, it was weeks 3 to 6 versus placebo. In the 12-week arm, it was 9 to 12 versus placebo. The secondary outcome was continuous abstinence out for 6 months. And then we looked at safety and did an intention to treat analysis. And if we had missing data, we counted you as a smoker. These were the participating sites. So there were 17 sites around the country and enrollment started during the early COVID period and continued after. And here's our consort diagram. It's a lot of boxes. It's easier if you just follow. Does this show? Oh, it doesn't show. Okay. If you count the right-hand side, it's 810 participants were enrolled. 82% completed 12 weeks and 76% completed 24 weeks. And it was very similar across groups. And here's the participants. So the average age was mid-50s and a little bit more than half were female. Again, a lot of boxes, but since they're so similar, you can just pick your column and just follow it down. We had about 16% were African Americans. Otherwise, it was pretty much white, not very many Hispanics either. People were pack-a-day smokers. And they had used a lot of other products in the past. These were not new people who had not tried to quit before. More than half had already used some other kind of nicotine product. So these were people who were the hardcore that we see. Here are the outcomes. Let me orient you. It's going to be first, I'll show you the 6-week versus placebo. Then I'll show you the 12-week versus placebo. Same setup. So the orange bar here is the cytisine. I try to say cytisinicline, but I will be saying cytisine a lot. And the blue bar is the placebo. And you can see that the primary outcome, which was 4 weeks of abstinence at the end of treatment, was substantially higher in the cytisinicline group with an odds ratio that was 8, that was highly statistically significant. And the secondary outcome, which was could you keep off cigarettes for out to 6 months, was also statistically significant, although the difference was less, still highly significant. Here are the 12 weeks data. if you look on the left-hand side, you see the primary outcome. So about a third of people were abstinent by the end of treatment in the last 4 weeks compared to 7%, which was an odds ratio of 6.3. And in the secondary outcome, it was over 20% compared to 4.8, which is an odds ratio of 5. So again, highly statistically significant. We did look at we did a mediator analysis to see whether this was something that was seen across all categories or whether it would be different from one group or another, whether it was more effective in one group. We looked at age, sex, race, cigarettes per day, menthol, and number of prior quits, and didn't see a clear evidence of a difference. Then we also looked at point prevalence, which is, have you in the last 7 days had a cigarette? Asked it every week. And you can see here that there was a clear separation between the cytisinicline and the placebo groups. But what was also very interesting about it was that if you look at I think it's a dark green line here, that's the 12-week group, and compare that to the orange line, which is the 6-week group, because you see that both of them are going up for quitting. And then at 6 weeks, when you stop taking it, the 6 weeks starts to go down. But if you continue to take it for 12 weeks, it keeps going up, which suggests that there's also new quitting that's happening. And that is what we see with varenicline as well, and suggests that maybe even longer treatment might be even more effective. So that's a very hopeful sign. Okay, what about safety? There were no treatment-related SAEs in this serious adverse events that were reported. There were some, but none were treatment-related. There were adverse events, but they were mostly mild and moderate. And the most common ones, if you look at this, were insomnia and abnormal dreams, as we see with varenicline. But what we didn't see was nausea. There was actually less nausea in the active groups than in the placebo groups, which was quite a change. And that is one of the barriers to people using varenicline, although we often are able to get around it. So this study, like any study, has limitations. We had a limited number of non-white people. We excluded people with unstable cardiovascular disease, serious psychiatric illness, current illicit other substance use, and everybody got behavioral support for 12 weeks, which is probably not how the medicine would be used if licensed in the United States and presented to the healthcare system. So here are our conclusions. If you look at the middle box, that's our conclusion, which is that this phase 3 multi-site placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial, the first large trial conducted in the US, demonstrated that a novel regimen of cytisinicline, along with behavioral support, has robust efficacy and excellent tolerability for tobacco dependence. And there was an accompanying editorial from one of our colleagues at Penn State who said, yeah, this looks important. So that's where we were. But that was the first study. What about the second study? So let me show you the data from the second study on this next slide, which is, if you look on the left side is the primary endpoints, and then on the left side of the left side is the data from what I just showed you, and then the next one over is the data from the second trial. And you can see they're almost exactly the same, slightly different, but basically the second trial replicated the first trial. And even that the observation of nausea not having much nausea was replicated in the second trial, and the safety looked the same. So that remains to be published, but it's out there. Okay, so you could say, well, okay, great. We've got a drug and we know how to use it. It just should go onto the market now. And I would argue that, it's sort of like nicotine replacement when it first became available. We know it worked, but we often didn't really know the best way to make it work and how to use it. And so I think there are a lot of research gaps that remain to be answered. The most important probably, well, I don't know, one of the two most important is the effectiveness and safety in populations that weren't included in the trial. So obviously non-whites, low-income populations, people with other substance use disorders, other mental health disorders, patients with HIV, lots of groups in whom we don't yet know if it's effective, although it seems like it probably will be, but we should figure it out. The second one I think that's really important is how's it going to work in medical practice? So we've been doing efficacy studies. What is the effectiveness going to be when it's used in different settings with perhaps less behavioral support? It's an important question. Then how does it compare to other cessation medicines? Well, we already know that one trial says it's better than NRT. There was one trial that compared it to varenicline, and it was didn't quite meet the non-inferiority difference, but it was close, and it had many fewer side effects than varenicline did. And then bupropion, nobody's compared it. So that you could compare it, but you could also think more creatively about combining it with other medicines, and could you increase the effectiveness, because it's effective, but still most people are not quitting. So could you, increase cessation rates by combining medicines like we do for hypertension and diabetes and lots of other things. And finally, we think that the mechanism of action is by affecting nicotine dependence. So could it be effective for medicines that for nicotine products other than cigarettes? So that's what we decided to do next. So the company has, with funding from both NIDA and their own internal funding, looked at the question of, can cytisinicline treat other forms of nicotine addiction, specifically nicotine vaping? And the rationale is that people are trying to quit vaping. Some do it on their own. Others are having trouble and need help. And there's little evidence to guide treatment at this time. It was effective. Varenicline was effective for vaping cessation in one trial in Italy that was published recently. A different population of smokers than the younger adults that we generally are worried about in the United States. In the US, we don't have an FDA-approved medicine, and in the UK, their regulator has licensed a nicotine mouth spray, which we don't have available in the US because the FDA didn't approve it. But that has this nice hand-to-mouth thing that people like for smoking cessation as a vaping cessation aid, just because it was so similar to other things. They didn't require extra trials. So that's where we are. We didn't have anything. So we did a trial which was published this summer, and this is the trial, and you can see the list of characters here who were behind it. And it was funded by both NIDA and Achieve. And this will probably look familiar because it's a similar design. It's a simple efficacy and safety trial that lasted 12 weeks for the new cytisinicline drug regimen with behavioral support for vaping cessation in both groups. Double-blind. Sample size goal was 150 as a sort of a pilot trial, sort of proof of concept. It had a 2-to-1 cytisinicline to placebo ratio. And the reason for that was in order to get more safety data, also to make it much more attractive to people who want to join a randomized trial. Everybody took one pill 3 times a day for 2 weeks, or 12 weeks, excuse me. Everybody got the same behavioral support that you heard about before, weekly visits. And everybody was followed for 16 weeks, which was 4 months, which is 1 month after ending treatment. Again, the criteria were you had to be an adult, you had to be using daily a nicotine-containing e-cigarette, but not be currently smoking or have smoked in the last 30 days. And so you had to prove that with both a baseline saliva cotinine that was high enough and an expired CO that was low enough. And you had to want to quit vaping and want to start taking a medicine within, to set a quit date within 2 weeks. You had to be medically and psychiatrically stable like the other trial, similar criteria. And we again did a negative screening for drugs of abuse. We specifically asked about but allowed cannabis. We thought that it would be scientifically a better study if we included only people who were not on cannabis, because then you would be looking only at smoking with nicotine. But we figured that from a practical implementation, real world perspective, that would not be good because there's so much co-use, especially in the younger population. So we allowed it, but we asked people not to smoke cannabis for 24 hours before coming in for their tests. So the primary outcome was biochemically verified continuous abstinence, last 4 weeks of treatment. Secondary outcome was continuous abstinence out to 16 weeks, and point prevalence. Otherwise, very similar. It was done in these 5 sites in the US, and done more recently. Here's our consort diagram. We enrolled 160 people. It was 2-to-1 for cytisinicline. And we stratified by a history of smoking because we thought that people who never smoked and were vaping compared to people who had switched from smoking to vaping might have a very different response to this medication. And so we wanted to make sure we had equal numbers in both groups and that we didn't have power to really look at the difference. And we had good compliance with the trial, with most people completing 12 and 16 weeks. So here's our sample. It's different. It's younger, not surprisingly. The average age was 34. Again, a little bit more females than males. It was more white than the previous sample, but it's also true that in the United States, the people who are vaping tend to be more white than who's smoking. Not a lot of Hispanics either. They, when we asked, had you ever had smoked 100 cigarettes, which is kind of our definition of ever smoking, or ever, well, maybe ever regularly smoking, almost 3/4 had smoked in the past, and the others had not. But if we asked, have you ever had a cigarette, which is just looking at ever experimenting, it was like 85%. The age at first e-cigarette use was mid-20s, but it ranged widely from 12 to 60. People were using disposables mostly, as they are now, and probably if we did it now, we'd have even higher disposable rate. And people liked fruit flavors and didn't really choose to use tobacco, even though they were adults. Okay, so the results are here. So looking again at biochemically verified abstinence at the end of treatment, the last 4 weeks of treatment, you see that it was 31%, almost 32% in the cytisinicline group compared to 15% in placebo, which is an odds ratio of 2.6 and statistically significant. In the secondary outcome, there was still a difference and an odds ratio of 2, but did not achieve statistical significance. Here you can look at the point prevalence, abstinence by group, and you can see that there was a clear sign, although overlapping confidence limits in many of the weeks, that cytisinicline was more effective than placebo. In terms of adverse events, there were no serious adverse events, probably reflecting the youth of the population. And there were certainly adverse events, but they were not serious. And we saw the same pattern of there was more abnormal dreams and more insomnia in the cytisinicline group, but not more nausea. So again, limitations, limited number of people who were not white. We excluded people with those serious diseases that we've discussed before, CVD, psychiatric, and illicit substance use. Everybody got a lot of behavioral support, and most important, these were only adults. We cannot generalize to adolescent vaping. So we concluded that this regimen, combined with behavioral support, is well tolerated and more effective than placebo to help e-cigarette users stop vaping at the end of treatment. But we need larger and longer duration trials to confirm the effectiveness and determine if the benefit will persist, obviously. So what are the next steps? So at the moment, Achieve has announced that it plans to conduct a fully powered phase 3 study that it has funding for. So that's planned, and they're expecting to start it probably in the second quarter of 2025. So we will have an answer, but not for probably another year. And then this summer, FDA granted cytisinicline this status called breakthrough therapy, which frankly, I'd not heard of before. If you don't know regulatory stuff, this is all new, which meant that there wasn't another drug for this indication, and that it was an important thing that we needed a drug for. And what it means is that the FDA will sort of help and guide the company to develop a vaping cessation aid. They didn't get it for smoking cessation, and I don't think they tried, but they got it for vaping cessation, and that's where we stand. Okay, I want to then move up. That's kind of the data that I have to show you of the work that we've been doing. Now I want to sort of put it in context and to look at what we have in terms of the summary of evidence. So the Cochrane Systematic Review was most recently updated in 2023. And what they found was they said there were not very many randomized trials, and that's true. They said cytosine was better than placebo with increasing quit rates by 30%. Notice that is only 1.3, which is very different than what we saw in our trial. But ours is one trial. It's more effective than NRT patch, but there was only one trial, so you couldn't do a meta-analysis. And their sense was it may be comparable in effectiveness to varenicline with fewer side effects. So that was that one. And then literally a year later, another one, independently done review, which was done to support the fact that the WHO was developing its first ever clinical guideline for smoking cessation. And they wanted to look at all medications. And so in this one, which included our study for the first time, obviously the relative risk went up because the odds ratio was higher for ours study than the other studies, but otherwise similar results. And the conclusion was it was more effective than placebo, no medicine, usual care, and NRT. Okay, so what are the next steps for cytisinicline? And some questions. So the company took the data that I've showed you and went to the FDA for what they call a pre-NDA new drug application meeting and said, you asked us for this information. Here's what we did. We got the results. Does this look like we've now done so that we can put in an NDA? So they want to sort of make sure that they've got what they need. And the company said, and the FDA said, it looks like the efficacy data are very strong, but you only have 12 weeks of exposure to this drug because you haven't done any trials that lasted any longer than that. And this is a drug that people are going to probably use more than 12 weeks or use it repeatedly. So we really think, and the guidelines say, that you need to have a longer period of exposure, which was the first time they had mentioned it to the company, which the company was a little unhappy to hear, because in order to gather, let's say, a year's worth of exposure means you have to do a study that takes a year, which means you can't put in an NDA for another year. And basically that's what happened. So the company had to actually go back to the market and raise money to do an open label, non-randomized exposure study. So they went back to the people who'd been in their studies, who already had 6 to 12 weeks of exposure, and if they were smoking or vaping, they said, would you like to try some more cytisine and use it longer and take it up to a year? And so they started this summer doing this trial, and they've enrolled, I think 400, 500 people, and are just waiting for the data to accumulate. So I was extremely unhappy to hear this, because I thought that we already know that this is a drug that's been used in many parts of the world for decades, admittedly not with a lot of careful safety data, but there was no signal that there was some really worrisome thing that was going to happen. And that's what happens in the post-marketing period is, you can find things that are less common that you won't find in an 800-person trial. But there just seemed like there were not a lot of, it seemed unlikely that we were going to uncover something that was that bad. And you have to compare that with the fact that people are still smoking. We don't have another new drug. And if you delay the appearance of a new medicine by a year, more smokers won't quit, more people will die. And it seemed to me that asking for more safety data before you approve a drug that's an old drug that's been out there was not the right decision. I don't get to make those decisions, but was not the right decision. And so I worked with a colleague of mine from our modeling group to do a mathematical model to ask the question of how many more people are going to die because of this delay of a year. And we came up with, a number and showed that it was, probably there wouldn't be that many people dying of a rare side effect, and have published it. I did this entirely separate from the company so that there wasn't the sense that the company was, pushing it, although obviously it helps the company. That's where we are. It got published in JAMA Health Forum. I don't have slides for it, but it was published in August. So if you want to see it, it's one of these, very nice modeling studies. A little dry, but comes to the right answer. Okay, so that's the plan. The chief says publicly on their website that they plan to submit the new drug application to FDA in 2025, probably, I would say, in the second quarter. So that's good. And then the FDA has, I believe, 10 months to decide. So maybe by 2026, this might be on the market. But, will FDA approve it? Data are good, but the FDA gets to decide. And how quickly will they, I think the company will probably ask for what's called fast track status. We'll get a decision faster, but whether that'll be granted, who knows? So there's still, while it looks impressive, I think there's still uncertainty about whether it's going to happen. And it's not until it happens that you really can go forward. But still, we need to start planning, I think. So I think it might be approved in 2026 and be available. So just to let you know what the situation will be, it will be a prescription-only drug. They have branded. What did they brand? I mean, the drug's not novel. What they branded was the dosing regimen. And they think that that will not allow any other manufacturer to sell this medicine in the United States, except and use that dosing regimen. And no other medicine you can't use cytisine as it is now. So should it be over the counter in the future? Probably. It looks it's sort of over the counter in some countries, but that will be yet another round of trials that would need to be done. Another thing that would be good is if you had a long-term formulation so that you could take it once a day, which apparently I think they're working on. I don't know for sure. And it's going to be a brand name drug, as we said. What'll it cost? That's always the last question that a manufacturer will tell you. My guess would be that it will be priced slightly lower than varenicline. Varenicline is now a generic drug, but unfortunately there are not a lot of manufacturers, and so the price hasn't come down that much. So it's not going to be anywhere like it is in Poland. The old regimen is $30, maybe $50 now. So it's not going to be that cheap, but hopefully it won't cost a lot. And fortunately, also the varenicline, the manufacturer of varenicline, which was Pfizer, had done a lot of work with health systems to get them to cover varenicline. So if they're covering varenicline, hopefully they will cover this as well, although it might be, until there are some guidelines out that say that this should be a first-line drug like others, they might still charge it a higher copay, which could be a problem. That's my guess about what might happen. Some more questions. So I think that I'm really excited about this because I think we need a drug to counteract the clinical inertia for tobacco treatment that exists widely in the healthcare system that I know, probably in your system also. And I think that US clinicians will prescribe it. I think they've, gotten a lot of questions about it. People seem quite interested. And I think we are looking for something new. We know that when other new drugs come out for smoking, people use it a lot. So I think it's a real opportunity for us to make a difference. And I think maybe it would be an opportunity to then increase the US health system's priority for treating tobacco use, which is a challenging, I feel like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. So I think there's a real opportunity, and we could think about how that might be. And I'd be interested in any ideas that people have about how could we make this happen. I think we also need to be sure that this drug reaches marginalized populations, which fits in the overall theme of this conference. I think that's going to be essential. That's the group who needs it. So I think we should reframe this as an opportunity to increase smoking cessation rates, both the reach of of drugs and our efforts and the effectiveness, both, and to reduce inequities in access to tobacco treatment. Finally, let's not just look at ourselves. Let's think about more broadly, the world. So, and a group of us, there were like 20 of us that were led by Natalie Walker from New Zealand, who did one of the early trials, put together a commentary in addiction that was about 2014 or so, that was called Getting Cytisine Licensed for the Worldwide, a call to action. And what they did, what that basically said was, one, we need to fill in the research gaps to maximize cytisine's efficacy and tolerability. I would argue that in the last, so many 10 years that we've made a lot of progress in doing that. But the second was to identify a strategy to make it globally available and affordable. And I think that's the challenge that we will have as it becomes available. And as I mentioned before, the WHO have put in their first guideline for tobacco cessation, in which they included cytisinicline or cytisine as one of the effective tobacco cessation treatments on par with the others that we're much more familiar with, NRT, varenicline, and bupropion. So that's where we stand. I think it's a real opportunity for people interested in global health as well to really think about how we can use this. And I actually learned recently that one of my colleagues who does work with HIV patients in Africa has gotten an NIH grant to support a trial that will include cytisinicline in sub-Saharan Africa. So the data's coming. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Really exciting. I'm actually feeling but really associated we get medicine developed. Approved, and I've worked on dozens, and right now half a dozen with breakthrough therapy and fast track status. So that is a really big deal. I'm not working on any smoking cessation medicines at this point. Mine are for depression, post-traumatic stress, epilepsy, et cetera. But that's a really big deal. And for FDA, I mean, I know you're disappointed, but that's warp speed. And if FDA has agreed to accept an NDA with only one phase 3, presumably using your other, that's huge. If the NDA can be filed in 2025, that's incredibly aggressive if it hasn't even started. But even if it slips into 2026, that, I mean, compared to normal approval processes and filing, that's really quickly. And again, I'm involved in numerous fast track and breakthrough therapies, and that can be leveraged. And I've been kind of mentally writing the label. The fact that the data may not be compelling for other forms of tobacco other than smoking really doesn't matter. The indication, smoking cessation. So typically what manufacturers do is take the narrowest possible path to get approved on the market. As far as payment, they might charge a lot more because it'll be a new drug, but almost certainly it'll be reimbursed. So for some period of time, it will be a prescription, and that limits access. But that means that's the key to equitable access. And that has to be leveraged. And when they're negotiating the labeling, that's a time that that Pinney Associates, we really work on equitable access. So this is just really exciting. And don't be too disappointed with FDA, because from what you're saying, they're already being really flexible.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear. Thank you.
That was a wonderful talk. One question I have is, how does cytisine differ from varenicline?
It differs. The primary thing was when varenicline was developed, the manufacturer, which was Pfizer, knew about cytisine. They understood the mechanism, and they said they fiddled with the molecule to make it more lipophilic, so that varenicline would get into the brain better, and because they thought that would make it more effective. And so that's the main difference. But it does hit some of the other nicotine receptor subgroups in a different way. And so there's a little bit of difference. It's not just all alpha 4 beta 2. There's some others.
And that explains how they were able to get an IND and then an NDA or apply for an NDA.
That's how
Those
varenicline
differences.
got one, because they changed the molecule and it was a
Okay.
different drug. This cytisine is the same drug that grows on the trees. They haven't done anything fancy with it. They just harvested it.
Okay, and the side effect profile is less, so less nausea. So differences in the molecules, which also impact the side effects.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's my understanding of it.
Hi, Trish CEO from Brown University. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, very exciting as well. I had a question about adherence to the medication. TID dosing as a clinician is very concerning. I remember when acamprosate was introduced for alcohol dependence, and acceptability and adherence were not very good. So I know you said they are working on looking at long acting, and that's promising, but I just wondered if you looked at
Yeah.
adherence in your study.
Yes, I neglected to present that. I'm sorry. The adherence was very high. It was like most people took at least 85 or 90% of the drug, but this was a very controlled clinical trial, and they had to fill out an electronic diary every day. And if they didn't, they were reminded. So and they were paid well for doing this. So
Yeah,
this is probably as good as it gets. And then the question is, what will it become?
yeah,
But we'll have to see.
yeah.
I think that could be a barrier.
Yeah, that's my impression too. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Howdy, that was very exciting and also very clear, which is not always combined. So that was delicious.
Well, thank you.
But my name is Rolf Parker and I'm from Public Health Response Research. I'm a Vermont Department of Health grantee. And my memory was that there was a Pfizer funded study in varenicline on adolescents, which found that it wasn't actually even effective on adolescents. I'm just wondering, is there any data out of Eastern Europe about efficacy of this for adolescents or not?
I'm not aware of any at all.
All
But you're correct also about the varenicline. The one varenicline trial, the trouble was that they couldn't get kids to really take it.
Ah.
And it wasn't effective.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for a great presentation. It's a really exciting body of work. My question is about the vaping cessation trial. I thought it was wise to stratify by former versus never smoking status, and wonder if you have explored whether effects differ, or if not, whether you hypothesize they might differ.
Oh, yes, I didn't put that in. So I can tell you that again, it's a small sample size. It's 160 people, so not so many, but that didn't look like there was a difference based on whether you were a smoker ever or not, which was the thing that I thought that was most interesting, or whether there was a, or sex or age or race or, well, it was so white. It's really not, you can't say much, but it was, it looked like it worked across the board. There was something else I was going to say. Oh, well, you didn't ask, but I meant to put in the slide that looks at, if people are vaping and they take this drug and they stop, but they used to be smokers or have ever been smokers, are they going to go back to smoking? And so we did look at that and found that it was quite low, but it wasn't zero. It was, most of these people had used cytisine to quit smoking. I mean, had used e-cigarettes to quit smoking, had switched over. And it was around between 5 and 9% or something. So there was a difference. It didn't look like it mattered. So I think that's something that we still need to be paying attention to.
Hi, Nancy Kara Murphy from Brown University. Such a lovely and fascinating talk. I'm wondering, I work with a number of individuals who use nicotine and have overweight or obesity. Did you look at weight gain in either of the trials, and what did that look like?
Yes, we did. And we didn't find much. There was a little bit of weight gain, and it didn't seem to matter. I don't think this has a weight gain effect, but I don't think it has a bad effect. just doesn't have a weight suppression effect.
Still time for questions. If people have other questions or comments. Well, Nancy, I couldn't be happier with that. Lecture is a perfect fit for the conference and just fascinating. So I thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.